times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this special livecast, which is called Media Architecture Today for Tomorrow's Cities. My name is Michiel de Lange, and I'm an assistant professor at Utrecht University in the Media and Culture Studies department. Today we're going to address an issue, or we're going to talk about media architecture. And what we want to address actually is the question, fairly simple you could say, what actually is media architecture and why does it matter? So let me briefly say a few words about this topic to start. Media architecture is a term for a newly emerging discipline at the intersection of the digital and the physical. It brings together architects and planners, interaction designers, software developers, activists, academics, to explore the design of urban spaces from both a spatial angle and a digital media angle. Now, a recurring international event in this field is the so-called Media Architecture Biennale, or MAB. And the upcoming edition of MAB, which is organized by the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences together with Utrecht University, is slated to take place in June and July 2021 in Amsterdam and Utrecht, and is co-organized by me and other people, including two of our speakers today. One of them is here physically, Frank Surenbroek. Nana Verhoef is present with us via Zoom. And the other organizer, Martijn de Waal, will actually host a second live cast about media architecture on October the 1st. So be sure not to miss that one. And in it, he will delve deeper into the issue of urban futuring. Now, with the Biennale, we wish to explore how the design and deployment of new media technologies like urban screens, interactive art, installations, and digital sensor networks can shape urban life beyond the mere spectacular. So how can media architecture help shape the public debates about possible futures of the media city? And we feel that this public discussion or these public debates around possible futures of the media city are extremely urgent and relevant today. Why? Well, you know, despite what technology companies like to claim, media technologies in our cities today are never neutral. Just think of how platforms like Airbnb and Uber impact housing or mobility and the general livability of our cities. Or think of how smart technologies are being used on a massive scale to extract valuable data from us as citizens. So urban technologies always embody certain implicit assumptions about what urban life is, can be, or should be. And often, more often than not, this is driven by the narrow interests of specific parties rather than the general interests of the public, you could say. So we believe it really matters how we think of and design these media technologies for today's and tomorrow's cities. Now, we have four speakers with us today who will share with us their visions on the power of media architecture. And in order of appearance, these are Dave Colangelo, who is an assistant professor at Ryerson University in Toronto. He's also an artist and a researcher and author of the recent book called The Building as a Screen. Second, Frank Surenbroek, who is here physically present with us, who is a professor of spatial urban transformation at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. And Frank has published widely on issues like participatory planning and democracy. Third, Nana Verhoef, who has just recently been appointed a full professor of screen cultures and society at Utrecht University and is one of the founders of the Urban Interfaces Research Group. And she wrote a book called Mobile Screens, the Visual Regime of Spatial Navigation, amongst others. And last but not least, we have with us, also via Zoom, Filippo Lodi, who is the head of innovation and knowledge management at UN Studio. And Filippo will share with us the perspective from, let's say, a more professional angle. So how is media architecture actually being deployed in the field of professional urban design? Now, without further ado, I would like to ask you, Dave, to please share with us your visions on what media architecture is, and also perhaps give us an impression of what you feel is the power of media architecture.
Okay, thank you, Michiel. Yes, good morning from Toronto, and thank you for inviting me here today to tell you more about my ever-evolving relationship with this thing that we call media architecture. I want to begin by acknowledging that where I'm speaking today is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. I'm compelled to recognize this in order to honor this land and its traditions, draw attention to the injustices of the past, while reinforcing a commitment to peace, friendship, and respect. Take a moment to reflect on whose land you are on, wherever you are. Media architecture, for me, is an emerging subset of technical, social, and economic conditions and practices for personal, professional, political, and playful digital creation and communication that include large outdoor projections, programmable architectural facades, and urban screens. Media architecture can be characterized by a certain scale and spatialization of media in the built environment, and a resultant public visibility on and offline. Media architecture is also exemplary of today's multimodal spatialized media ecologies, creating transversal environments that alter the Cuban and urban sensorium, while exhibiting environmental characteristics in their transmedial expressive screen-like qualities and associative audio, interactive, and network capabilities. Media architecture enable and necessitate the development of new concepts and strategies for creative and communicative digital practices and audience experiences from a few different perspectives. The first being the appreciation of media architecture as central to the orchestrated coordination of space, people, and media. The second, for me, is media architecture as sites for the development of practices of public and participatory information, visualization, and representation. And the third, media architecture presents opportunities for curation and community strategies and frameworks that blend the logics of urban space and monumentality, as well as digital placemaking, social media, and the public sphere. Overall, media architecture can support more participatory public media and communication industries and practices in which we identify and engage with collective presence, memory, and action through data, architecture, and network communication. At the same time, media architecture also represent the threat of the automated production of space, the exacerbation of inequitable power relations, and corporate colonialism. They are dense transfer points for the development and study of persuasion and ethics within complex, interdependent systems of power and communicative infrastructure. I approach media architecture as a discipline to be historicized, theorized, and practiced. My work involves archival research inspired by media archaeology to uncover the branches and revisited dead ends from which this form and its genres emerge. I explore case studies that include qualitative and quantitative sentiment analysis of social media, combining close and distant readings of data to reveal trends and impacts of various practices and use cases. I also conduct interviews with cultural producers in Europe and North America, working within different funding and political structures which shape this field. And I also use what you might call research creation or action research projects. This work flows through my studio, Public Visualization Studio, a firm that I co-founded in 2010. We use art and design-based methods such as human-centered design thinking to create media architecture works in order to experience the technical, social, and political conditions related to the field firsthand. Through this, we really believe that we are better able to analyze the effect of urban media interventions on cultural production and communication. So here's a few examples. I've already shown a few in a few of those slides. This project was called eTower. So it was a massive multi-user public data visualization of the city's energy on a symbol of the city's energy itself, the CN Tower. The project was presented during Nuit Blanche in 2010, and we programmed the lights of the tower to glow faster and brighter with each bit of energy that we received. So you could see it kind of going through some blue, and then it would get a little bit warmer in color, and it would cycle through this throughout the night. We wanted to further test the limits of these emerging technologies and practices, but also the ability for media architecture to perform as a kind of critical and creative spatial and social practice, focusing on relational and ethical communication goals that these spaces can support, such as building trust, cooperation, transparency, and value for stakeholders. We want to build on this desire to bring communication infrastructure to consciousness, and consciousness to communication infrastructure. So we developed this project called In the Air Tonight. The project was presented for 3 consecutive Februaries at the Ryerson Image Center building in Toronto. Changes in wind speed and direction detected by a weather machine that we installed on the roof were visualized with a blue wave, and tweets with the hashtag homelessness made the building glow red, as well as a mobile interface that was connected in the system. Also in consultation with Kathy Crow, the nurse in residence at Ryerson University and a homelessness activist, I worked to manage a team that helped to organize social media activism and photo voice workshops with local homeless people at support centers nearby to animate the building and the Twitter feed with stories and perspectives, while also adding functionality that allowed participants to make donations to local centers through the website we created. Building on this, over the past 5 years, I've worked with to turn the Ryerson Image Center building into a communicative and expressive platform for the campus community. Since the fall of 2016, members of the community can submit lighting requests on our website, which are then evaluated by a panel of staff and student representatives. Here's a fun one we created on a request from Dr. Anthony Bonato in our math department. And this demonstrates how program level innovation and support can lead to creative embodiments of identity at different levels of an organization or a city, not to mention the community engagement and sentiment generated online as a result. But the Rylights event that I think I'm most proud of is when we modified the code that we made for In the Air Tonight to draw attention to the plight of missing and murdered Indigenous women and their families. So this project used the same software, but changed the hashtag that was involved so that we could draw attention to a different cause. So at the heart of everything I do, either in creation or critique of urban media environments, is a question of how the combination of rhetoric, ethics, and modes of delivery can give rise to more equitable and just spaces. Here's a more recent project. So this one hasn't been launched yet. This is just a rendering of what we hope to do. It's a project called Receipts. So working with local Asian community groups and led by 2 of our collaborators who are part of the Asian diasporic community, we're working on a system that allows us to capture testimony of people that are experiencing micro and macroaggressions as a result of the pandemic. So shadow pandemics such as anti-Asian racism that's been happening all around the world, where we want to think about ways to address this public safety issue in public space itself by capturing this testimony, anonymizing it, and then presenting it in a compelling way in public space. So that's just a rendering. Hopefully we'll have more information in a month up on our website after we launch. After doing all this work, it's clear to me that more work on the digital, communicative, and creative capacities of media architecture is necessary. As with all fields, technology, automation, and globalization are continuously changing how we live, work, and relate to one another in and through the hybrid spaces that we inhabit. The proliferation and development of urban media environments and associated media forms such as ubiquitous computing, AI, network sensors are undergoing rapid changes evidenced by the importance of the Internet of Things, big data, smart city initiatives like this one that just failed in our downtown Toronto from Sidewalk Labs, which I'm sure a lot of people heard of. As we seek to create networks of sensitive communicative objects through embedded electronics and algorithms in cities, that react to intelligent and highly surveilled people and things in order to achieve greater efficiency. Also considering regional variations in technologies, politics, networks, and aesthetics. And finally, considering how this form of communication continues to develop and expand, the causes and concerns to which it may be directed are expanding, and audiences are continuing to develop the skills and affinities necessary for more meaningful interactions in the hybrid media spaces and narratives engaged by media architecture. This is an example that I wrote about recently. The We Live Here 2017 project was a powerful anti-gentrification message from residents of two towers in Sydney slated for redevelopment. It was led by a documentary filmmaker and communication specialist in the community. And residents organized a late protest against the local government, which included multimodal touchpoints on social and traditional news media. Now, what I love about this project is that it embodies the phrase, "nothing about us without us." It's a central principle of the growing design justice movement, and one that we're interested in at Public Visualization Studio. It's also highly applicable to the foregrounding of ethical considerations in contemporary media architecture practices today. As urban media environments grow in popularity, diversity, and complexity, we must continue to develop theories and practices that allow us to better understand their critical and creative potential in areas like public health, governance, digital placemaking, city and self-branding, education, and entertainment. So a lot of these ideas that I've mentioned, as well as some of the projects, can be found in my book called The Building is Screen, which Michiel mentioned. It was just published by Amsterdam University Press this past winter, and I was really looking forward to being there to do a book launch this year, but that'll have to wait a little bit. And I should also mention the connection to the Media Architecture Institute. So this is an international organization that brings together practitioners and researchers from academia and industry to work at the intersection of media, communication, interactive tech, architecture, and the built environment. And we participate in and help to organize events like the one you're experiencing right now. But of course, the bulk of the credit needs to go to the amazing team that's been working on this in Amsterdam and Utrecht, Nana and Michiel and Martin. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention wherever you are, and I'll pass this back to Michiel.
Thank you so much, Dave, for this really good introduction, this very rich overview of the power of media architecture. Now, what I really liked about the presentation is how you pointed out the importance of working towards equitable and just spaces. But just maybe one short question before we move over to the next speaker. What do you consider the major threats to these lofty aims nowadays in our cities?
I think, one of the major threats, I think, has been there from the start with media architecture, and that has to do with just the funds and the sort of permissions required to set up these, especially the sort of large scale screens and environments. So I think capital is a threat in a way. Thinking about how that relates to real estate and how groups are forming land trusts to try to address issues of power and equity within the sort of ownership and management of spaces. So I think they would be interesting to see if that develops more, if we start to see sort of more community-owned and organized media architecture spaces because of how important they're becoming.
Great, thanks. That's actually quite a nice transition, I guess, to our second speaker of today, Frank Surenbroek, who is a professor of spatial urban transformation. And you could probably also maybe embark us on a little journey, maybe through the eyes of the, let's say, the urban design professional for a bit, and also maybe the real estate perspective that Dave was also alluding to. So, Frank, go ahead.
All right, thank you. I'm Frank Surenbroek, Professor of Spatial Urban Transformation at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, Faculty of Technology. And what I would like to share in our presentation today is the relation between public space and media architecture. And I think if we think about public space, it's one of the most essential spaces that we have in our cities. They make up our cities, they make the social fabric, they shape the conditions where we found our day-to-day activities, but also where we have the things which are fighting each other and where we have the important and really important task to get acquainted with the other. And especially in our fragmented and more tribalized societies, in combination with the densification, it's even more one of the big challenges for the future of our cities, how we deal with public space. But if we look at public space, if we think about public space, when most of the time we will see this kind of public space that we have on the first slide. But before we go to the next one, I'd like to introduce the technicality that, of course, public space is not just the ground floor level, but it's made up by its physical construct, so by the building which address themselves at the site, which together create an environment. And then again, if we think about our cities today, it's not so much only as those great classical places that we love, like the Amstelveldje on the canals, which we just showed. It's also about this kind of places. And this kind of places is for example, the Arena Boulevard, which is what you can call a new public space. And they have been erected like in the last 20, 30 years all over the Western cities. And what makes this space interesting, we did a lot of research on this, is that these are actually one of the only spaces where all layers of society in one or the way of the time come there. And at the same time, therefore, are able to maybe to see each other, get acquainted with each other. But these spaces are not designed as public domain. They're actually designed as transition spaces which you have to pass through as efficient and optimized as possible to enter a venue or to enter a shop and then get out there and make sure you get away very fast. So it really lacks this domain quality, which is so necessary to provide opportunities to linger and to see what you can call in sociological terms the other. This is where I think the media architecture, where it's a combination of spatial design and media and interactive installations, might be promising to find new ways to create amenities for people on this kind of new public spaces to see each other. But how does it work? Well, if we look at the interactive installations, then what you see is that most of the time these are more installations which are rather artistic, which are an object in space, not necessarily interacting with the space itself, not necessarily making a spatial difference. It's very temporary and it's more even dimensional. And so that needs a transfer, so there's like a transfer problem. And then on the other hand, if we think about the spatial analysis, of course, we have to understand much deeper, of course, how these spaces are actually made up, how they work, but also the kind of perception and the feeling people have about these spaces and which parts they like and don't like. And moreover, of course, also the rhythm of this kind of spaces, because they have very stark differences if you compare this to our traditional and the center public spaces which we all love and which we all like to go to. This is much more fragmented. And then if we transfer this into thinking what can this combination of spatial design and media architecture do? How can it make a difference in this space, creating amenities for social interaction, creating amenities for public domain? Then the most simple one, which we also tried out in a very primitive way, as you might see on the slide, is to think about these kind of spaces when they're made for the masses. But when there's no masses and it's just a stone desert, so you don't feel very happy to be there, you just want to get out there as fast as possible. And at the same time, it needs to provide more what you should say, more conditioning, more guidance for the people who are there at that moment. So one of the simple things, of course, we can think about is that we carve out pedestrian areas, pedestrian lanes, especially during the night, especially during the evening, when there's not so many people. So that's the first thing, of course, the most simple thing you can think about if you start applying these technologies in space. And on a whole different level, you can also think on or elaborate on this. This was actually an intervention which was done in, I believe, Japan, which was resembling the Pac-Man kind of style around a bin, which has a very educative principle. But then again, if we think about this from a spatial perspective, if we think about these routings which are important for pedestrians to pass, but feel like a very long, dull route, then these kind of interventions might help to create some sort of stepping stones, to create a rhythm in this long way that people have to pass from one side to the other. So instead of having it as an isolated thing which is nice and fun, it can become something which is a guidance for people at some points in their in the time and in the place when there's not so many people. And then, of course, if we scale up the ambition, then we can start thinking about more responsive urban spaces. And I like a lot this example from Barcelona, where it's nearby an important transit, where people pass by when it's the peak hours, but at the same time, which is quite empty and quite dark, and it has a little wall against it, so it doesn't do much when it's not used there by the pedestrians in the peak days of the hour. It's used also for the North African market, for example. And what I like here is that all those LED lights, as well as the sound installations, make it possible for people to really do something in that space and make it their own, or make it more playful, provide their own interpretation of what that space can do for people, instead of that it determines what people should do. And so what I like is that it's really putting it a step further in thinking how we can activate space. And I think activating space is not necessarily putting people like a row of cows in one direction, which of course our first example was, but also providing opportunities without dictating that people should use it like it's meant to be. Well, a whole different interpretation, which I like if I think about how to make our spaces more active, our public spaces more active, is this example, which is actually from a beautiful city heart in Utrecht, and it's showing old historical patterns. But what I like as a concept is that it shows the possibility to evoke identity, to evoke parts of memory or history, or even future if you use this technology, to put a new layer of meaning on a space. And if we think of these new public spaces like the Arena Boulevard, they're really very clean. So they're cleaned after every event, after every the masters leave, and then you don't see any traces. There's no stickiness. You don't see any trace of what happened there before or what will happen afterwards. And I think what I like about this kind of technology is that it provides the opportunity to think how you can create more stickiness to this kind of new public spaces. And that it's not about memory only, but it's also about what it will happen there in the future. So it's a whole new way of thinking to project identity. And well, if we then go to the three-dimensional again, a lot of the problems, if we look at redesigning existing spaces, it's when there's one facade, one part of the space, which is actually doing nothing for that space. So we call that they're like there with the back of the building is there, or it's a parking garage with a blind facade, or there's no window or whatever, and they're actually not acting. There's it doesn't provide any amenity for the people in that space. And of course, there's a whole story behind this projection, but I just like it as an example of such a blind wall can be transformed into a front site, into an active site, therefore transforming the whole identity and dimensions and the orientation in that space. And I'm of course, I shouldn't say too much about screens, as Nana will talk about that much more than I can. But what I like is that it's the screen, and using the facade as a screen is not a mere commercial activity like we see on a lot of places in the city, but it tries to really, as a public space, tries to create conditions where people feel at home, where people feel at ease, where people feel invited to interact or to linger or to get more restorativeness in the hectic times of the city. And this is what you see in the central station of Amsterdam, where they use some of these screens to also project this kind of images that people can relate to, that taps into how we what are great times, and which is a whole different way of using screens in the city than just for commercial use, I think. Well, and then if of course you think more on how to activate a space, it's also sometimes about, you know, putting the finger to an element in space which hasn't been used or hasn't been noticed or is not particularly attractive, and see if you attract more people to that space, if you draw attention to it, that it becomes something which, you know, could create more meaning, could create more layers, more interesting dimension to the existence of that public space. And I like this example that these urban animals more or less activate pockets which are actually side streets and maybe not so interesting, and suddenly they become a center stage. And what does that mean? What does that effect does it have on the space? As one of the final ones, if you think about squares and streets, but especially squares, if you think about them and how to make them better, of course, the classic knowledge is that we know that it's so much about the facades around it. It's so much about how it makes people feel safe or comfortable, the kind of activities that are there on the ground floor. So much of the transformation naturally will take place from the surroundings from the building surrounding the square. But of course, if that's not possible, if these facades are not able to be used or whatever reason there is, then of course there's the challenge to make it the inside-out strategy. And what I like about this kind of technologies, and we can debate a lot about the colors and about the position, is that if we don't see it as a mere object that we place there in the space, that this object creates and recreates the dimensions of this space. So it matters a lot if you put this on 2/3 in the space or in the center or whatever. And I think that alone can provide a whole subdivision of spaces, which you therefore create sometimes, for example, a space which is way too large to feel comfortable for people, and you start subdividing it. And these kind of inventions are able to, could be able to subdivide it. Or be in the other direction, could be like the modern way of we use traditional inventions like fountains and so on. Well, and then, of course, is the question of people and of time, as I'm reminded to, is, of course, the foyer quality. So when I started about the new public spaces, the challenge is that it's not inviting to linger there. And how to create spaces, how to find out which part of that space might be able to attract people for a longer period of times. And what I like about this is you can imagine you shift this around. So you test on different part of the square where it really creates this foyer qualities. I have to look at if I'm really 1 minute.
One more minute?
One more minute. All right, then I wrap it up. I think two challenges I like to put on the table if you think about media architecture and public space. One of them is process. We did a large project together with a lot of companies, and it has to bring together two design fields: the field of urban spatial design, whether it's architects or urban designer for landscapes, and interaction designers. And both of them work normally with a black box process. And I think, if any, trying to combine those two and their co-creation process is one of the challenges, how to create solutions that really start to work. And final remark on off. I see a lot of great interactive installations, but when they're off, when it's not dark, you saw all those pictures with light, then it's actually, it does nothing with the space. It's actually like it's a logistic part of the supermarket instead of acting and providing some amenities to the space. So I think there's also a big challenge how to improve those ones. Thank you.
Yes, Frank, thanks very much for this very rich presentation. There's two very interesting tensions that I got out of it. One is your observation from the Arena Square, that often the most inclusive public spaces are perhaps not publicly owned, but actually privately owned and more about commercial spaces. I think it's a really interesting parallel to the online so-called public spaces, all kinds of social media platforms, which are of course privately owned, but deemed by many to be the new public spaces online, at least. So there's a very interesting parallel there. And I do wonder where media architecture fits in here. And the second tension that I got from your presentation is also what seems to be a really crucial one, and I hope that somehow we can get deeper into that tension as well. On the one hand, media architecture as, making people feel at home somewhere, sort of a sense of security and well-being and restoration, as you call it, versus the inevitable friction that also comes to play when you're meeting the proverbial other that you also talked about. So that, I feel, is also a crucial sort of tension that I think media architecture operates in. Maybe we get there later. For now, I want to move over to Nana, who's ready to share with us her views on the connection between creativity and criticality in media architecture.
Thank you. I'll be speaking from my home in Rotterdam. I hope you will see my slides as I am driving without hands here. Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Actually, I am in a way picking up on the comments that Frank just closed with. I remember that once I had a presentation about urban screens and media architecture, and I ended with an image of a screen that I had been discussing with actually turned off, and then making immediately visible that when a screen is turned off, it's nothing but a surface. And I want to turn on the screen a little bit for the moment and actually talk about what we could say the performative potential of screens. And for this, I want to combine two perspectives. Speaking from the privileged position of holding the new chair of screen cultures and society at Utrecht University, tells you my background is in screen studies. I want to look at media architecture as a perspective on the dense and variegated screen spaces that we inhabit, or screen cultures, plural. And on the one hand, I want to think for a little bit on architecture as a perspective on what screens do, but also bring in through the same gesture the use of maybe a screen studies perspective for understanding what media architecture does and what media architecture as a specific field of design or object entails. So I'm interested in the pervasive presence and diversity of screens or screen technologies and practices, screening practices in our lives, as screens and related technologies play such a central role in the different scales of our life worlds, plural again, both within the social fabric of our everyday life and also contributing to the movements and dynamics and frictions within wider societal, discursive, institutional, cultural, political frames and structures as they shape and transform various forms of being, acting, and relating. So media architecture is a perspective for me that foregrounds the situatedness, the spatiotemporality and materiality of screens and screening practices. Indeed, we can call this the architectural aspect of screen media. But also screen theory, as it has been influenced by media theory, but also performance theory, as a perspective on architecture or media architecture in specific, in the rich variety that was already sketched in the previous presentations by Dave and Frank, screen theory can bring with it a focus on how the urban built and designed environment shapes and also implies a performativity and subjectivity. And these are crucial. How screening materials in the layered sense of the word operate and are practiced, produce, position, and perform. So how architecture as medium positions us as spectators and users or engagers. We can call this a performative perspective on urban screen and media architecture that shifts our thinking from surfaces to interfaces, a perspective that I will return to in a bit. Can we have the next slide? Some images. No, I think the previous slide, actually. That was probably already up when I was talking and not seeing the screen. I want to share a few slides that resonate with the contemporary moment of living in lockdown or post-lockdown cities. And we encounter a clear material paradox of screens as space-making surfaces daily, working from home or from our mobile offices, fixating us in front of our devices, registering our micro movements, while connecting with others that are elsewhere doing the same thing, or en route and in transit and sharing public spaces with others, each in their own vehicular bubble, where screens may pause, block, or reroute our passages. We have the next slide. We also use the canvases of and above our built environment for posting messages as commentary or subtitles in response to what is happening on street level or below. Layering space, but also time of living and dwelling in various ways. We see the next one. Screening can be mobile and migratory, can transform and intervene, repurposing materials to reposition us, making us stop, hold, and sit down, to take in the spectacle and to relate, reflect, and respond in the encounter. Next one. So I'm interested in screens and practices of screening in public space, specifically the street level that I mentioned, as perhaps a primary site of encounter between individuals or companion species, as pointed out by Frank as well, but which is also a domain that is shaped by discursive, historical, and institutional framings and infrastructural regulations, and a primary place for frictions, contestation, and possible intervention. And I'm specifically interested in, maybe also in response to something that Frank mentioned, but I'm specifically interested in experimental, artistic, and art activist design that use and respond to the effective, relational, and actionable affordances of new and emerging technologies, and also the social and political frictions that they bring about. Think of algorithmic technologies, sensing technologies, geolocative and mobile technologies, responsive or interactive technologies, by integrating them in site-specific installations and architecture, as well as live performance and everything in between. And the images that you see on screen here, of course, I'd like to refer to the Media Architecture Institute as an organization, but also the Connecting Cities Network, with its rich, the curation of its of a rich variety of media architecture in the very broad sense of the word. And media architecture is such a field of innovation and experimentation and social engagement, reflexivity, and criticality that is taking place literally where it matters, in public space, in the street, and in the now. And as such, I think media architecture can respond to our present and presence, but also make visible and debatable what is perhaps right below the surface. And this is where it becomes particularly interesting. Media architecture, not just a perspective on how screens take up space, are material, and are situated, but also as an object, as a field of design, implies for me a very wide bracket. So it's urban screens, but all forms of media art, mobile media art, installations, and architecture proper, if you will. And what stands out, and this is something that Frank mentioned, is that these are often very singular works, often also around events. They're material, they're situated, they're performative, and they're very particular. And these, therefore, are very interesting sites for analysis and reflection, and for the theoretical development of concepts with which can help us understand the dynamics of screen spaces in the broader sense. So I'm interested in approaching instances of media architecture as thinking objects, or objects to think with. And this is I'm really interested in the meeting point, therefore, between academic theoretical scholarship, philosophy, and design practice as both thinking and making practices, and both very creative ways of engaging with our present moment. So just a few, just want to quickly go over a set 3 actually of concepts that I think are worked with in design, but can also be a starting point for reflecting how these instances operate. These are how design and analysis mobilize, how they scale and offer sites of crossing. Next slide, please. So mobilizing, how does media architecture and urban screening, urban interfacing, if you will, offer sites for mobility, and how do they mobilize public space? I think it's important to think of the multiple meanings of the word mobilizing as a form of activating and making mobile, but perhaps also destabilizing the status quo, and also a response to the present mobilities and dynamics of our public spaces. But with design, these mobilities can also be reshaped or rerouted or designed properly. And this is an instance actually that is maybe relevant for today's experimentations with designing for distance to open up actually public space and allowing for mobility within public space, but adhering to the sort of physical distancing regulations that we're working with or facing in this day. Another aspect, next slide, please. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I don't need a lot of more time, Michiel. So yes. I hope I'm okay.
1 more minute.
Just a few words about scaling. We've seen the project that Dave was involved in, or was leading actually. And I wrote about this work, and I think it's very inspiring, but it's also a very, very good example of how media architecture makes us think as a lens about how screens work as a form of scaling. Not just connecting between online and offline locations, between the internet and the on-site spaces in public space, but also, of course, the difference between the micro screen and the building surface is striking in this installation. And also there's another way of scaling at work in this project, and we can maybe use it, scaling as a lens, to also look at other projects in the way that they sort of address societal issues that are maybe invisible to a lot of people, and bringing them out, and also in that sense scaling them up. So scaling, we can think of in terms of sort of the geometric properties, but also more in terms of what the weight of certain societal issues. And lastly, I think what a lot of next slide, please. Lastly, one of the properties that I think are full to how screens in space or urban forms of media architecture have an impact on their space is that they allow for or produce forms of crossing. And crossing you can understand as a location where a meeting point of different routes of the crossing, like a square where we meet others and where trajectories are temporarily connecting. But it's also a form of relating where the intricate properties of one could be interfering into another, opening up to a third space, if you will. So I think this also alludes to the performative potential of maybe media in general, screens in particular, but also media architecture as a as a form of interfacing. Next slide. So I just want to wrap up my 2 cents for this session with a bit of advertising and promotion of a project, but also to expand a little bit on this notion of interfacing, which is, I think, a useful and productive way to think about what media architecture does and what it produces and what it can do and how it can intervene and transform our public spaces. In this recent special issue that you saw in the image, I think just before, maybe I'm now back on the screen, I don't know. Yes, here it is. We have conceptualized as a research group in Utrecht, and Michiel is also part of that research group. We have proposed to understand media, art, and performance in public spaces as simultaneous sites and also apparatuses that afford various forms of interaction with and within these spaces. So central to a question there, but I think is relevant for thinking about media architecture and why does it matter, is how media architecture or urban interfaces can act as privileged site to negotiate contemporary frictions in and about these spaces. The use of graffiti in commercial areas, the artistic and critical redesigning of shopping windows, or augmented reality annotation of routes through the city, or media facades, they provide cases in point in this issue. And from a performative notion of interfaces or interfacing, we emphasize the materiality, mediality, and performativity of urban technologies and other forms of spatio-temporal design, so as to connect their material specificity with their affective, relational, and actionable affordances. And this is where I close my presentation.
Okay, Nana, thanks so much. Filippo, I hope we still have enough time for your presentation now. While you are being switched on, let me just say that I think what's really interesting, Nana, about your talk is that you're saying media architecture is not just an object to look at, but also a heuristic lens to look with. So I think that's an important contribution, and also really like the, well, let's say the performative part of it. If you're saying media architecture can be performative, it means it can actually do things, and then it also means that it is inherently transformative. And I'm also really curious to find out during our programs that we're about to do in the future how that will work. So, Filippo, can I ask you to please share with us your thoughts from the professional field, please?
All right. So I will kind of slide through my thoughts. I bring a very different sort of perspective in a sense. So I bring only 2 stories into that. Reintroducing myself, I'm Philippe, and I lead UNSX, which is our experience lab within UN Studio. And it's a team of multidisciplinary talents. So we work in a kind of very multidisciplinary fashion around the field of design, where let's say media, the whole subject of media architecture interacts with, and that's maybe our notion of what that is expanding. And we all live in a kind of society at the moment that is in a kind of rough change. This was just last year a picture I took, but if you cross around the same city today, the image, the sizing, the kind of experiencing of that is very different. So the notion of what media is for us is very much about the experience, and the experience is the relationship of what we do with everything else that surrounds us. And the manimal here is an idea of what experiences is for us. It's very much about the idea of the hybrid notions that are not either white or black, facades that are not facades but that are screens, right? So everything comes into kind of an hybrid mode, and that brings up to maybe kind of a statement, and that is that we really advocate the idea of designing experiences and not designed by disciplines. So what if we could design as architects not just the buildings or the landscape or the urban spaces, but we design across disciplines, and that's where the practice always fight with, because we package our built environment into constructible packages for professions, and that the professionality is in fact a limit to what experience is. And so, can we break that experience? Can we break that wall of professionality and talk about experiences? That's our statement. And I bring two examples of what we mean by that. One is something we've done in Milan just a few years ago. We've worked a lot on health and the effect of what holistic health means. And we created a series of pods that relate with that. We know that stress is very, it's a big factor in the world, and there's a lot of different places around the globe that are trying to defeat that, like these kind of stress rooms, rage rooms called in Moscow. And we try to devise a kind of a construction where you can go inside, you can hook up to the technology, you can be measured. There's a couple of measurement fields, and you can act in different ways. You can de-stress yourself either in a calming way or in a more active way. And that kind of stress level of connection really creates an immersive experience. You are inside a kind of a media bubble, but that experience really affects your health and your psychology, and you can go inside multiple times, and that changes you. The second story that I'm kind of I think that I find it very interesting to bring is something that we've been doing over here in the Netherlands, in Eindhoven, which is a building. It's the CNA. In fact, I saw this very same building in Dave's presentation, but just a couple of years younger. This is just finished. And you see this building lives a different kind of history. So as it was initially made after the kind of Second World War and Reconstruction, it had a lot of space. It had an importance. It had a kind of an urbanistic place, and throughout the different kind of phases of constructions, it kind of became a lot decluttered. And it's a retail. So the biggest importance in retail is to be seen, right? You see the facade. So that decluttering asks us, okay, can we rechange that order? So we know that the shopping window is not anymore visible. So can we create a new sort of shopping window? And that's the additional shopping window is that's what we've created. And that is not only a shopping window, but it's also a kind of a media element. And how we've been working with that is creates a new relationship with the square, as the square function, in fact, much as a lobby space of the train station in Eindhoven. It creates a different place there. And in order to kind of understand these logics, we've been doing a lot of interviews with all the kind of people over there. So our team was there overnight, over day. We've really tried to embrace the user journeys around the city, and really trying to recreate and understand what the effect of that relationship between these kind of elements would recreate during day and during night, how that really recreates a new form of urban space. And that went into kind of different phases. So we were looking at possibility to have an analog part and a digital part component to it. How would they embrace daytime and nighttime? How would the emotional journeys of your experience in that building kind of reflect that very much that design? And how could we create an interface for the users to interact in a direct way, or maybe an indirect way to that? And how could that be even more of a platform for maybe different sorts of plugins or different sorts of sources of input? So not only the user buy or the passerbys, but that could be all sort of like different inputs, and create a different outputs, and really create a change in what that environment would do. So, and that created this kind of platform that is now present at the moment. And these are sort of two ways that in a very short way that describe the way we think in terms of experience design, and the way that we relate the architecture to the physical environment to people, to urban space, across scales, and the way that we are kind of embracing that. So, and I kept it very short, so that's my side.
Okay, Filippo, thank you very much. That's actually really good because then we can make it in time. Really rich material and good stuff to think with. Thanks very much. What really also strikes me in your work is another interesting tension that I see between, on the one hand, what did I wrote down? Yeah, so on the one hand, as with the retail space, for example, that is really all about finding ways to grab the attention of an audience versus another type of media architecture that is much more about, let's say, public participation and inclusiveness, not so much about attention grabbing, but perhaps more in what Frank called also a restorative interventions. So I really liked the tension that you conjured up there. We've reached the end of our program, and all I have to do is now wrap up briefly by thanking first our 4 speakers of today, Dave Colangelo, Frank Zurenbroek, Nana Verhoef, and Filippo Lodi. Thanks very much. I also wish to thank Pakhuis de Zwijger for hosting us today, in particular Anne Wijnen, and also thanks to Morgana, who is here with us today. Thanks for your help as well. And if you want to be kept in the loop on the Media Architecture Biennale, please check out our website, mab20.org, and also look into our various social media channels. So we really hope to see you in October, October the 1st for our next live cast, and also, of course, in June and July 2021, which I really hope will actually take place for the Media Architecture Biennale. Thanks.